11,000 feet above Germany, November 9th, 1944. The number 3 engine is burning. Number 4 is already dead. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the flight deck in a fine, persistent mist. The B-17 is descending at 400 feet per minute, whether anyone commands it or not. 9 men are still aboard. 1 cannot escape, and the co-pilot has just made a decision that mathematics says will kill him. The aircraft was a flying fortress, in name only now. At this altitude, on this heading, with this damage, the designation had become a kind of cruel irony. The Boeing B-17G that Second Lieutenant William Metzger Jr. occupied as co-pilot had absorbed punishment that would have torn lesser aircraft apart in the air. But the fortress had a reputation for bringing crews home, even when home seemed impossibly far away. That reputation was about to be tested in ways that no engineering margin could accommodate. The bomber had taken flak over the target. German 88mm anti-aircraft fire had found the formation during the bomb run, and this particular aircraft had caught fragments in patterns that suggested the gunners below had bracketed their altitude with lethal precision. The number 4 engine, mounted on the far right wing, had taken direct damage. Oil pressure dropped to 0 within seconds. The propeller windmilled briefly, then ceased. The crew feathered it, turning. The blades edge on to the airstream to reduce drag, but the damage was already spreading. Number 3 engine, inboard on the right wing, continued running for several minutes after the initial hits. Then it began to burn. Engine fires on a B-17 were survivable if caught early. The aircraft carried fire extinguisher systems that could be activated from the cockpit, and the engine nacelles were designed with firewalls to contain damage. But the fire on number 3 was not responding to the extinguisher discharge. The flames were being fed by something the crew could not reach or isolate. Fuel line damage, perhaps, or hydraulic fluid finding its way into the heat. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily. With 2 engines out on the same wing, the asymmetric thrust was forcing the pilot to hold constant opposite rudder just to maintain heading. The control forces were enormous. A B-17 with full power on all 4 engines required physical strength to fly in normal circumstances. With half the power gone and the remaining engines screaming at maximum continuous thrust, the aircraft wanted to roll and yaw into the dead side. Only constant muscular effort on the controls kept the wings approximately level. First Lieutenant Donald Gott was the aircraft commander, the man in the left seat responsible for every decision that would determine whether the crew lived or died. Gott was working the throttles on the 2 functioning engines, trying to balance power against the asymmetric drag, trying to keep the airspeed above stall while not accelerating into a dive they could not recover from. Metzger, in the right seat, was handling the emergency procedures, fuel management, fire suppression attempts, monitoring the engine instruments for any sign that the remaining power plants were failing. The workload in a crippled bomber was relentless. There was no time to think about what might happen. There was only the next checklist item, the next gauge reading, the next decision that might buy another 30 seconds of controlled flight. The bombardier had released the bombs over the target. That much had gone according to plan. The formation had made its run, the ordnance had fallen toward the industrial facilities below, and the bombers had begun the long turn toward home. Except this bomber was no longer part of the formation in any meaningful sense. It was falling behind, dropping below, becoming separated from the protective mass of aircraft that gave each individual fortress its best chance of survival. Stragglers attracted fighters. This was known. The Luftwaffe pilots who contested American daylight bombing raids understood that a damaged bomber separated from its formation was vulnerable in ways that a healthy aircraft surrounded by others was not. The concentrated defensive firepower of a tight combat box could discourage or destroy attacking fighters. A single crippled aircraft, struggling to maintain altitude and heading, could be approached from angles that minimized the defensive gun's effectiveness. But on this day, at this moment, fighters were not the immediate problem. The immediate problem was physics. The B-17G had a maximum gross weight of approximately 65,000 pounds. Empty, without fuel or bombs or crew or ammunition, it weighed around 36,000. The difference was capability, but also burden. Every pound of remaining fuel was simultaneously the possibility of reaching friendly territory and the risk of feeding the fire that was consuming the No. 3 engine. Every pound of ammunition in the defensive gun positions was weight that the two remaining engines had to lift against gravity. The mathematics of flight became brutal when half the engines failed. Rate of climb became rate of descent. Ceiling became a memory. The questions changed from how high to how long, and then simply to where. The crew was spread throughout the aircraft, the pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, the bombardier and navigator in the nose compartment, the flight engineer at his station behind the cockpit, monitoring systems and serving the top turret guns, the radio operator at his position, the ball turret gunner, the waist gunners, the tail gunner. 10 men in a damaged metal tube, hurtling through hostile airspace at diminishing altitude, wondering whether they would reach the ground under control or in pieces. The fire on No. 3 was not going out. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. William Metzger had been born in New Jersey in 1922. He grew up in a working-class family during the Depression years, when economic hardship shaped the expectations and character of an entire generation. The young men who would eventually fill the cockpits and gun positions of American bombers came from farms and factories, from small towns and urban neighborhoods, from families where money was scarce and work was the measure of a person's value. Metzger had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, joining the flood of volunteers who transformed the United States Army Air Forces from a modest peacetime organization into the largest air armada the world had ever seen. The USAAF would eventually number over 2 million personnel and operate tens of thousands of aircraft across every theater of the global war. Building that force required training programs of unprecedented scale, turning young civilians into pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and mechanics in months rather than years. The path to a co-pilot seat in a B-17 was not direct. Metzger would have progressed through classification testing to determine his aptitudes, then through primary flight training to assess whether he possessed the fundamental coordination and judgment to control an aircraft, then through basic and advanced training to develop the specific skills needed for multi-engine heavy bombers. Along the way, candidates washed out in substantial numbers. Some lacked the physical reflexes. Some could not master instrument flying. Some simply discovered that they did not possess the particular combination of aggression and caution that military aviation demanded. Those who completed the training pipeline emerged as officers and rated pilots, but they were not yet combat crew. Additional training in their assigned aircraft type followed. For B-17 crews, this meant learning to operate as a coordinated unit, understanding the specific procedures and emergency responses for the flying fortress, developing the teamwork that would determine survival when everything went wrong at 25,000 feet over hostile territory. Metzger's pilot, Donald Gott, had followed a similar path. Gott was from Wyoming, from a landscape of open spaces and self-reliance that bred a certain type of practical competence. He had proven himself capable enough to be designated as an aircraft commander, the pilot responsible not just for flying, but for every decision affecting his crew. The relationship between a pilot and co-pilot was professional intimacy of a specific kind. They sat side by side for hours, shared the physical labor of controlling a demanding aircraft, learned each other's habits and reactions until anticipation replaced communication. The crew had been assigned to the 729th Bombardment Squadron, part of the 452nd Bombardment Group, which operated from Deigham Green in Norfolk, England. The 8th Air Force bases in England were small cities of American personnel, scattered across the English countryside, launching missions against targets throughout German-occupied Europe. The routine was numbing and terrifying in alternation. Briefings in the pre-dawn darkness, takeoffs into the English weather, assembly into formation, the long climb to altitude, the penetration into enemy airspace, flak, sometimes fighters, the bomb run, the turn for home, the count of who made it back and who did not. By November of 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a phase of grinding attrition that statistics made abstract, but experience made personal. The 8th Air Force was launching missions with hundreds of bombers at a time, attacking industrial facilities, transportation networks, oil refineries, and military installations deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe's fighter force had been damaged by months of combat and the loss of experienced pilots, but German air defenses remained lethal. Flak batteries surrounded every significant target. The anti-aircraft fire was radar-directed, increasingly accurate, impossible to evade through maneuver because the bombing doctrine required straight and level flight during the run to the target. Crews measured their survival in missions completed. 25 missions had been the original tour length, raised to 30, then to 35 as the war continued and the demand for experienced crews grew. The mathematics were not encouraging. If a crew faced a 3% loss rate per mission, the cumulative probability of completing 35 missions without being shot down, killed, or captured was distressingly low. Men calculated these odds and then chose not to think about them, because thinking about them made flying impossible. Gott and Metzger had flown together enough times to develop the wordless coordination that marked experienced crews. They knew how the other would react to an engine failure, a fire warning, a wounded crewman, a fighter attack. This knowledge was not theoretical. It had been built through repetition, through the small emergencies that punctuated even routine missions, through watching other crews make mistakes that cost lives. Neither man had a reputation for recklessness. The surviving documentation suggests competence rather than flamboyance. The crews who accumulated missions and lived to complete their tours were usually the ones who followed procedure, maintained discipline, and avoided the dramatic gestures that made for good stories but often ended badly. Metzger and Gott fit this pattern. They were professionals in an organization that was still inventing the profession as it fought the war. The mission on November 9th was a strike against industrial targets in Germany. The details of the specific objective varied slightly across different accounts, but the broad outline was consistent with hundreds of similar missions flown by the 8th Air Force in late 1944. Large formations of B-17s and B-24s, escorted by P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, penetrated deep into German airspace, bombed their assigned targets, and turned for home. Most made it back. Some did not. Gott and Metzger's aircraft had made it to the target. The bombs had been dropped. The formation had begun its withdrawal. And then the flak had found them. The 8th Air Force had developed procedures for almost every contingency that could affect a heavy bomber in combat. Engine failures, fires, battle damage, wounded crew, lost navigation, fuel emergencies. Each situation had a checklist, a sequence of actions designed to maximize the probability of survival based on accumulated experience and engineering analysis. For an aircraft with multiple engines out and fire spreading, The procedure was clear. If controlled flight could not be maintained to friendly territory, the crew should bail out. The B-17 carried parachutes for every position, and the aircraft had designated exit points. Men had practiced the sequence in training. They knew where to go, what to do, how to clear the aircraft before it became a death trap. The calculation was coldly rational. A parachute gave a man a reasonable chance of survival, even over enemy territory. Prisoner of war camps were unpleasant, but they were usually survivable. A controlled crash landing in a burning aircraft gave much poorer odds, and an uncontrolled impact gave no odds at all. Gott and Metzger would have known these procedures intimately. They would have participated in briefings that emphasized the importance of timely decisions, the danger of waiting too long to order an evacuation, the commander's responsibility to balance risk against the competing obligations to complete the mission and preserve his crew. On most damaged bombers that made it back to England, the story followed a predictable arc. Damage sustained, emergency procedures executed, difficult decisions made, safe landing or controlled bailout. Crew members might be wounded, might require medical attention, might need time to recover before flying again. But they were alive. The mission records and after-action reports from the 8th Air Force are filled with accounts of extraordinary airmanship under pressure. Pilots who brought crippled bombers home on one engine. Crews who survived with half the aircraft shot away. Men who performed their duties despite wounds that would have justified abandoning their positions. The B-17's legendary ability to absorb punishment was not merely a function of engineering. It required crews who knew how to manage damage, how to improvise solutions, how to keep flying when the textbook said flight was no longer possible. Gott had demonstrated this kind of steadiness before. The fragmentary records suggest a pilot who handled emergencies with professional calm, who did not panic when systems failed, who made decisions based on assessment rather than emotion. Metzger appears to have been a capable complement, a co-pilot who could share the workload, monitor systems, execute procedures while the aircraft commander focused on the fundamental challenge of keeping wings level and nose pointed toward home. The crew had survived previous missions where survival was not guaranteed. This was unremarkable. Every crew that lasted more than a few missions had similar experiences. The 8th Air Force's operations were inherently dangerous. Accepting that danger and functioning despite it was not heroism in any conventional sense. It was the baseline requirement for the job. But the mission on November 9th was different. The fire would not go out. The altitude was decreasing. The formation was gone, left behind when the damaged bomber could no longer maintain position. 2 engines were producing power. 2 engines were not. The aircraft was controllable, barely, but the trend was unmistakable. Things were getting worse, not better. The boundary between safe flight and unrecoverable emergency was not a bright line. It was a zone of ambiguity, where the right decision depended on factors that could not be precisely measured. How much fuel remained? How far to friendly territory? Could the fire spread to the fuel tanks? Would the remaining engines continue to function? Each question had answers that were probabilities, not certainties. Gott made the decision that procedure demanded. As the aircraft continued losing altitude, as the fire continued burning, as the distance to Allied-controlled territory shortened but did not disappear, he ordered the crew to prepare to bail out. This was the correct decision. It was the decision that training emphasized, that experience validated, that gave the maximum number of men the maximum probability of survival. The pilot and co-pilot would remain at the controls long enough to ensure the crew could exit safely, then they would follow. The burning, uncontrollable aircraft would crash somewhere in the countryside below. The men would float down under canopies of silk, and begin the uncertain process of evading capture or surrendering to whatever German forces found them first. The order was given. The crew began moving toward their exit positions, and then something went wrong. The precise sequence of events that followed would never be fully reconstructed. The men who survived could describe what they saw. The men who did not survive left no testimony. What remained were fragments, observations, the kind of incomplete information that combat always generates. One crew member did not make it out of the aircraft. The accounts describe a parachute entanglement near the tail section. The exact mechanism varied in different tellings. Perhaps the static line caught on structure. Perhaps the parachute pack snagged on something as the man moved toward the exit. Perhaps the deployment went wrong in some way that left the crewman physically trapped, connected to the aircraft by the lines and fabric that were supposed to save his life. Whatever the specific cause, the result was clear. A man was still aboard the bomber, unable to free himself, unable to bail out, unable to do anything except wait for whatever happened next. In a B-17 configured for combat, the distance from the cockpit to the tail was approximately 70 feet. The waist section, where the side gunners operated, was perhaps 40 feet behind the flight deck. The tail gunner's compartment was at the extreme rear of the fuselage. The exact location of the entangled crewman was not precisely recorded, but he was aft of the cockpit, in a position where the pilot and co-pilot could not see him directly, could not reach him easily, could not do anything to help him without leaving the controls of the aircraft. The other crew members had bailed out successfully. They would descend through the cold November air, land somewhere in the territory below, and face the immediate problems of evasion or capture. Their part in this story was ending. For them, the decision had been made, the procedure had been followed, and survival was now a matter of luck and the circumstances of where they landed. But Gott and Metzger were still in the cockpit. The aircraft was still flying, or something. Approximating flight. The fire was still burning. The altitude was still decreasing. And there was still a man trapped in the back. The ethical geometry of the situation was brutal in its clarity. 2 men could bail out and probably survive. 1 man could not. If the 2 bailed out, the one would certainly die, either in the crash or in the fire that preceded it, unable to free himself, unable to escape. If the 2 stayed, all 3 might die together in whatever happened when the aircraft finally stopped flying. There was no procedure for this. The training manuals did not address the scenario where 1 crew member was physically trapped while others could still escape. The arithmetic of risk said that saving 2 lives was better than losing 3. The mission was over. The bombs had been dropped. There was nothing more that this aircraft could contribute to the war effort. Staying aboard served no tactical purpose. Gott and Metzger stayed. The decision to remain cannot be reconstructed from documentation. No one survived who was in the cockpit when it was made, but the outcome was observed. The aircraft did not continue flying pilotlessly toward whatever random patch of ground it would have hit without guidance. Someone was at the controls. Someone was attempting to bring the crippled, burning bomber down in something other than an uncontrolled impact. The logical conclusion is that both pilots remained. Gott, because he was the aircraft commander and the man trapped was one of his crew. Metzger, because Gott could not control the aircraft alone, not with the damage it had sustained, not with the control forces required to keep it flying on 2 engines. A deliberate crash landing in a damaged B-17 was not impossible. Pilots had done it before. The aircraft had a reasonably strong structure that could absorb impact forces if the approach was controlled, if the airspeed was right, if the terrain was suitable, if nothing failed at the critical moment. But those were large conditions, and this aircraft was on fire. The fire changed everything. A B-17 carried hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel in wing tanks. The fuel was not directly exposed to the engines, but fire has a way of finding fuel. Lines run through aircraft in complex patterns. Heat spreads. Structural integrity fails. The distinction between a survivable crash landing and a catastrophic fuel explosion could be a matter of seconds or a matter of inches. Gott and Metzger apparently calculated that the chance was worth taking. Or perhaps they did not calculate at all. Perhaps the decision was not arithmetic, but something else, some instinct that refused to abandon a helpless man while the capacity for action remained. They began the approach. Bringing a crippled B-17 to a crash landing required a sequence of actions that became progressively more difficult as the situation deteriorated. First, terrain selection. The pilots needed to identify a suitable landing area, which meant something flat, something long enough to allow the aircraft to decelerate before hitting obstacles, something without obstructions that would tear the aircraft apart on contact. From the altitude they were at, with the visibility they had, with the airspeed they were maintaining, the options were limited. German countryside in November was a patchwork of fields, forests, roads, villages. Some patches might work. Most would not. Second, approach configuration. A normal landing used flaps to increase lift at low speeds, gear to absorb the impact. But this aircraft's hydraulic system had been damaged. Whether the flaps would extend, whether the gear would deploy, whether either system would function at all was uncertain. Metzger would have been checking gauges, trying to determine what still worked, relaying information to Gott as they descended. Third, airspeed management. Too fast and the aircraft would not stop before hitting whatever lay at the end of the landing zone. Too slow, and it would stall, dropping uncontrollably in a manner that would ensure fatalities. The margin between these boundaries was narrow under normal circumstances, with two engines producing unequal thrust, with fire affecting the aerodynamics, with possible structural damage. The margin was narrower still. Fourth, alignment. The aircraft had to be lined up with the selected landing area, which meant turns, and turns in a damaged aircraft with asymmetric thrust were difficult. Each banking maneuver risked stall on the rising wing. Each correction required physical effort on controls that were becoming progressively less responsive. Fifth, timing. The fire was not going to wait. Every second that passed brought the flames closer to the fuel, brought structural failure closer to reality, brought the aircraft closer to the moment when it would cease to be controllable, regardless of what the pilots did. Gott and Metzger were attempting all of this simultaneously, in an aircraft they knew was dying, with no guarantee that success would save anyone. The descent continued. The altimeter wound down, hundreds of feet becoming thousands, then hundreds again. The airspeed fluctuated as Gott adjusted power on the remaining engines, trading altitude for speed, speed for alignment, alignment for hope. The ground approached. Fields became visible as distinct areas rather than abstract patterns. Trees resolved into individual obstacles. The scale of the problem became immediate rather than theoretical. The aircraft was still burning. The fuel was still aboard. The man in the back was still trapped. The crew members who had already bailed out were somewhere in the area, perhaps watching, perhaps already on the ground, dealing with their own situations. If any of them saw the final approach, they would have witnessed the extraordinary sight of a flying fortress, flames trailing from the right wing, descending toward a forced landing in hostile territory. The landing attempt was not successful in the way that success is normally measured. The accounts describe an explosion. Whether the fire reached the fuel tanks before touchdown, or during the impact, or in the moments after the aircraft came to rest, the result was the same. The bomber was destroyed. The men still aboard did not survive. Gott, Metzger, and the trapped crew member died together. The observable evidence of what Gott and Metzger had done was limited but conclusive. The aircraft had not crashed randomly. It had descended on what witnesses described as a controlled approach, attempting to land rather than simply falling. This could not have happened without pilots at the controls. The logical conclusion was that two men who could have jumped chose to stay and fly. The crew members who had bailed out successfully were captured by German forces. Their subsequent experience as prisoners of war was its own story, separate from the events aboard the aircraft. But they could testify to what they had seen before they jumped. They knew that a man had been trapped. They knew that the pilots had remained aboard. The official recognition came later, processed through the military bureaucracy that documented sacrifice and attempted to assign appropriate honors. Both Donald Gott and William Metzger were recommended for the Medal of Honor. The recommendations moved through channels, accumulated endorsements, reached the level of authority that could approve the nation's highest military award. The citation language, when it was finally written, followed the conventions of such documents. It described the circumstances, noted the decision to remain aboard, acknowledged the outcome. The formal prose did not convey terror or smoke or the roar of engines straining against physics. It stated facts in measured sentences, converting chaos into official record. For Metzger, the citation recognized that he had chosen to remain with his pilot to attempt a crash landing rather than bail out and save himself. It noted his knowledge that the probability of survival was minimal. It acknowledged that his actions reflected concern for a helpless crew member who could not escape. The medal was awarded posthumously. There was no ceremony where Metzger received the honor, shook hands with officials, returned to a life changed by recognition. There was only a piece of metal and ribbon sent to a family, a name added to lists, a story that entered the records of what Americans had done in the air over Europe. The contrast between official language and physical reality was vast. The citation mentioned damage and fire and the decision to remain. It did not describe the sensation of heat through bulkheads, the visibility reduced by smoke, the physical strain of controlling an aircraft that was disintegrating around them. It did not record whatever words might have passed between Gott and Metzger as they lined up their approach, whatever thoughts occupied their minds in those final minutes, whatever they might have seen through the windscreen as the ground rushed up. The official narrative was necessary. It created a record, established a precedent, communicated to others that such actions were recognized and honored. But it was also incomplete. It captured the decision without capturing the experience. It noted the outcome without conveying the duration. Of those final minutes, when two men who could have been floating safely toward prisoner camps were instead wrestling with failing controls and spreading flames. The 8th Air Force continued flying missions. The war continued for another 6 months. Other crews were lost over Germany. Other men made decisions that cost their lives or saved them. The vast machinery of aerial bombardment ground on, absorbing individual tragedies into statistical summaries, converting courage and terror into sortie counts and target assessments. Gott and Metzger became entries in the roster of Medal of Honor recipients from the Second World War. Their names appeared in books that catalogued such honors, brief paragraphs that summarized events for readers who would never fully understand what it meant to stay in a burning cockpit when the door to survival was open. The man they stayed to help, the crew member tangled in his parachute, died with them. His name appears in some accounts, absent from others. He became, in a sense, both the reason for their sacrifice and a figure obscured by it. They stayed because he could not leave. Their decision made his fate theirs as well. The physical evidence of the crash was absorbed into the landscape of a war that left wreckage scattered across continents. The specific location, like many details of the incident, was recorded with varying precision in different sources. What remained certain was the outcome. 3 men who might have survived separately died together because 2 of them refused to accept survival on those terms. The families received notifications. Gold star banners appeared in windows. The particular grief of losing someone to an act they chose, rather than to random chance, was perhaps different from other war deaths, or perhaps not. Grief does not calibrate itself precisely to circumstances. William Metzger's hometown would eventually recognize his sacrifice in the ways that communities recognize such things. Memorial plaques, mentions in local histories, the gradual fading of immediate loss into institutional memory maintained by ceremonies and records long after the people who personally mourned had themselves passed. The question of what his decision meant, what it represented, what it should teach, remained unanswerable in any simple way. He had a choice. He made it. The choice cost him his life. Whether this was wisdom or folly, courage or something beyond such categories, depended on assumptions about what life owed to others and what others could ask of us. The training had emphasized survival. The procedures had been designed to maximize the probability that crews would return to fly again, to contribute to the war effort, to win through accumulation rather than through individual sacrifice. Metzger violated the logic of that system. He stayed when staying served no military purpose, saved no aircraft, completed no mission. He stayed only because a man would have died alone otherwise. The B-17 that carried them all down was one of thousands lost over Europe. The 8th Air Force flew strategic bombing campaigns that transformed German industry and transportation, that contributed to the eventual Allied victory, that cost the lives of more than 26,000 American airmen. Each loss was individual. Each death was specific. The aggregation into statistics was a necessary abstraction that concealed 10,000 stories like this one, and 20,000 stories unlike it. Metzger was 22 years old when he died. He had lived through childhood in the Depression, through adolescence as war approached, through training as the nation mobilized, through combat as the war reached its decisive phase. His life was measured in ordinary years and extraordinary moments, the last of them lasting perhaps 10 minutes as a burning aircraft descended toward a field in Germany. What remained was a name, a medal, a citation, and the knowledge that someone once decided that another man's life mattered more than his own survival. This knowledge is not comfortable. It does not resolve into simple lessons about duty or sacrifice or heroism. It simply sits in the historical record, waiting for anyone who cares to find it, a reminder that some decisions cannot be taught and some courage cannot be measured. The sky over Germany is quiet now. The fields where bombers fell have long since been cleared, planted, harvested, built upon. The men who flew those missions are almost entirely gone, claimed by the ordinary passage of years if the war did not claim them first. But the decision William Metzger made at 11,000 feet, then 10,000, then 5,000, then in the last seconds before impact, that decision persists in the record. It asks nothing of those who read about it. It demands no imitation, no ritual observance, no particular response. It only says that once, on a November afternoon in 1944, a man who could have jumped chose to stay. And perhaps that is enough.